Welcome to another episode of Well, Don't Tell the Kids. I'm Janet Lee, your host, and today I'm speaking with my guest, Daniel Pink. Thank you so much for joining me today, Daniel.
Janet, thanks for having me.
Daniel is a New York Times best-selling author multiple times over. I was at a Northwestern event last night for NU Connect, and I wanted to know what you studied there.
I was a linguistics major, if you can believe that, and it ended up being a really great major for a couple of reasons. Number one is that it's, in some ways, it's the ultimate humanistic major because language is in many ways what makes us human. And the second thing that I really liked about it is that it was pretty, even though it is itself a discipline, it's fairly multidisciplinary. So I would have certain courses that were required for linguistics majors were also required for computer science majors because there's a very mathematical side to linguistics, but they're also required for, say, people studying poetry because there was that kind of work too. So I loved it. I thought it was a great major. I'm glad I did it.
And then you put it to practical use, going on to earn a JD. Can you just unpack that decision process a little bit?
Well, it wasn't really much of a decision, unfortunately. It was really just kind of a default that comes from being the firstborn child of a middle-class family in the middle of America and having been told over and over again that one needed something to fall back on, that you needed to have that kind of security. And so I kind of assumed that I would go to law school. I actually don't remember it ever being much in a decision. But I ended up going, and that I didn't enjoy so much, although I did manage to graduate, but I've never practiced law.
This was at Yale Law School in New Haven.
Yes.
I wonder then how you got to the authorship area.
Okay, well, it was a long and winding and unintentional road. So what happened was like many roads. So what happened to me was the following. I graduated from law school. I knew that I didn't want to practice law. I don't think anybody would have hired me to practice law. But what I was interested in deeply at the time was politics. So I decided that I want to work in politics. So I ended up doing that for several years and eventually became a political speechwriter and did that for a few years. And that was kind of interesting. But the deeper I got into working in politics, the more I realized that this is not how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. I found it, the two big problems were that I found it just even too cynical even for me, that everything was about short-term tactical advantage. There was less in the way of deep commitment or even smart strategy than I would have suspected. The other thing is that I discovered that I was pretty terrible at having a boss and that that I probably should not have a boss, that I should work for myself. And so in my early 30s, I left a job. I was working as the chief speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore. I left that job and decided that what I really wanted to do was write for myself, write under my own byline, write my own things. And that's something that I had been doing, quote unquote, on the side for, literally more than a decade. When I was in college, when I was in law school, when I was even working in these jobs, I was writing articles on the side. I did it in some ways the way that other people have hobbies. So instead of, going hunting or doing archery or going to my bowling team, that's what I would do as a hobby. It finally occurred to me after 15 years of doing this that I kind of liked doing it and that it was sort of what I was meant to do. And so I left my job. Now, again, I'm not a crazy risk taker, and I actually don't advise people to be crazy risk takers. I think it's very important to have a clear-eyed assessment of risk. And so when I left my job, my wife did not leave her job. She did not give up her health insurance. And so I went up to our house at the time on the third floor of that house and tried to say, can I write my own stuff and make a living writing my own stuff? And, it took a few years, but eventually I managed to, I'd done a lot of magazine writing back in the days when people actually read magazines. And then that led to a greater focus on writing books. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. But again, I'm a very prudent, I like to think that I'm a very prudent risk manager. So for instance, I've never had an office outside of my house. I'm talking to you now from the garage behind my house. That's been my office for 8 or 9 years now. I don't want to pay rent. I don't want to pay rent to anybody else. I am maniacal about low overhead. And so that's, I think it's one of the things that's allowed me and my family to carve out a kind of life that was really, really good for us, that it represents a somewhat non-traditional path, especially here in a extraordinarily professional-oriented place like Washington, D.C.
Well, I hope you're splurging on some kind of heat for that garage.
I actually have heat in my garage.
Excellent.
I do.
Good.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I have very good heat. It turns out there's this garage which we refurbished. This garage, which was built in like 1920, is
solid,
as well insulated as anything that you could possibly imagine. I mean, it is hermetically sealed, so that helps out a lot in heating and cooling, and also in quiet, because I'm a person who likes to work in silence.
Daniel has a recently published book called When. I don't know which one is your claim to fame. Perhaps it's Drive. I've been going through A Whole New Mind, which has been very interesting, published in 2005, and maybe you can go over the premise briefly. My main question is, how do you see the trajectory going? Is it the way you recommended 13 years ago?
Let me explain, Janet. Let me just, for your listeners, let me explain what the idea is behind that book, and then we can talk about that. So that book lays out an argument. That book lays out an argument, and the argument uses the two sides of our brain, basically the way our brains are configured, as a metaphor for what's happening in the world of work. And the metaphor works like this. If you think about our brains are divided in half. Mm-hmm. There's a left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now, there's been a lot of garbage written about left brain and right brain, so we can't go too far in taking this literally. But we know that our brains are also reasonably efficient, that over time they've divided up tasks. They have different specialties. So the left side specializes in tasks that are logical, linear, sequential, analytical. The right side specializes in tasks that are more about synthesis rather than analysis, about processing things all at once rather than step by step by step, really kind of about sort of the context rather than text. And again, we use both sides of our brain for everything that we do, but that division of labor, I think, offers a powerful metaphor for understanding what's going on in the world of work, at least as I argued in that book 13 years ago. And the metaphor works like this. It used to be that abilities characteristic of the left hemisphere, logical, linear, sequential, analytical, SAT, spreadsheet abilities, that those were the abilities that mattered most. And today, my argument is that those abilities still matter. They're essential. They're absolutely necessary. You have to have them. But they're no longer sufficient. And it's a different set of abilities more characteristic of the right hemisphere of the brain, artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big picture thinking, that those kinds of abilities, which are hard to outsource, hard to automate, are the ones that are becoming the first among equals. So that's the argument of that book. Now, does that remain right? Mm-hmm. The answer to that question, I think, is yes, it remains more right than wrong. But there are a couple of things that surprised me, particularly about the automation. I had written that it was going to be very difficult to automate certain kinds of right brain-like functions. Mm-hmm. So in the book, I wrote about facial expressions and our ability to divine emotions by reading facial expressions. And at the time, computers couldn't even distinguish my face from your face, let alone determine is Janet sad or happy, is Dan angry or scared. And now there's been some pretty serious advances in facial recognition technology and even ways to recognize emotion in faces. So there are certain kinds of right brain processes that are more automatable than I would have suspected 13 years ago. But the broad contours of the argument, I think, are generally right, that routine algorithmic skills are becoming commoditized, just in the same way that routine algorithmic physical skills were commoditized by forklifts or other kinds of machines. Routine intellectual skills are becoming commoditized. And so what we have to do is we have to be able to do things increasingly with our brains that are non-routine, that are, in the parlance of social psychologists and economists, heuristic tasks rather than algorithmic tasks. And I think push it even further, when we think about this emerging world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, where machines, software, robots, et cetera, are going to be able to do a lot of different kinds of stuff, I think the question is, what can human intelligence do? What are the sorts of skills that human intelligence needs to deploy to work with those smart machines, to supplement machine intelligence? So, again, I think for a 13-year-old argument, I think it holds up pretty well. Although I'll be, just to be clear, it's not perfect. It's not airtight.
Yeah, you talk about abundance, Asia, and automation. And I was just thinking, you talk about abundance as in our commercial, conspicuous consumption kind of society, which maybe we're moving away from a bit. I'm just speaking the world that I know in the U.S. But I just think about abundance in terms of maybe there would be a big change should that abundance, that we don't need to work all the time, that there would be the underlying ideas of economic scarcity and that drives commerce. It's sort of out there still, the idea of there wouldn't be as much work.
Yeah, this has always been a promise among people who thought about work in the moment and the future of work. There have always been these visions of that machines would get powerful enough, automatable enough, and also that in terms of actually doing the work, and that also that our needs would be so satisfied and oversatisfied that we wouldn't have the demand for all that stuff, and as a consequence, we would move toward lives of intense leisure, where you would work only a small number of hours in order to satisfy, basically to keep your lights on, and then beyond that, you would lead a life of leisure. That's never materialized. It's interesting to speculate why that is. I mean, at one level, we have. And I think that there are. I don't know for sure. I can speculate about the reasons for that. Number one is that we actually do have a fair amount of leisure in our lives. Even if you look at time use surveys, for instance, what it shows is that people do have more discretionary time than they realize, more discretionary time than they're willing to admit. Unfortunately, people squander it watching television or doing other kinds of passive entertainment. But even though everyone says that they are incredibly pressed for time, they have no leisure, the time use studies, particularly by John Robinson out of the University of Maryland, shows that it's actually people are working less than they say they're working in reality, and they have more leisure than they think. That's one possible argument. The second possible argument is a little bit more curlicue, and it's this: that if we think about labor economics, in some ways, we think of labor as something we do in order to buy goods and services and experiences like leisure. That labor is a disutility, and that we do it in order to get other things. And I actually think that for a lot of jobs, not all, that labor is not a disutility, but a utility, that people actually like doing it. Now, they might complain about exactly. They might. So if you think about somebody who is a pediatrician caring for kids, or you think about software engineers who are working on really cool projects and creating cool stuff, or if you think about people who really like their job, who want to do it, who obviously want to get paid, but the reason they're doing it is not simply to trade their time and effort for goods and services, that work has become more interesting, not for everybody, but for many people, work has become more interesting. It's become something that people want to do and derive satisfaction from, as you're saying, by the nature of the work itself. And so that could be one reason why we haven't moved toward widespread leisure. The other thing that that's I'm speculating. I don't know. The other thing that you see, and there's some interesting. I mean, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi did a lot of this research. Is that ultimately what human beings want? I mean, human beings want a lot of stuff, but among the things that human beings, among the human things that human beings want, like obviously we want to be able to, we want to have a home to live in, we want to have clothes, we don't want to be hungry. And I'm not even making a Maslow argument here, but there are some basic things that, like basically post-survival. once you do that, what we know about long-term well-being is that what creates a sense of long-term well-being is relationships, having people you love and having people who love you, feeling a sense of purpose, and also challenge. People want to be challenged. And if you look at the levels of satisfaction, especially in things like passive leisure versus active work, people are actually more satisfied moment to moment doing something active and challenging, even if it's under the label of work, than they are doing something that is passive and unchallenging, sitting on a beach all day, watching TV all day, even though that's at the level of leisure. So in many ways, our categories, work and leisure, don't really matter as much as, activity, challenge, and purpose versus passivity, stagnation, and drift.
That's a very good segue into drive, the surprising truth about what motivates us. I kind of picked up on internal versus external motivation being part of the thesis, and it's interesting that I'm in a Montessori world. So Dr. Maria Montessori is quoted that play is the work of the child. What made you feel the need to write Drive?
Yeah, well, part of it was that I was intrigued by the sorts of questions that we're chewing on right now. What is it that really motivates people, particularly when, as I tried to argue in Whole New Mind, when the nature of work has changed, when people are doing fewer routine, mechanical, algorithmic skills, either with their back or their brain, and actually will now be doing things that require more what I think are deeply human capabilities. Understanding, seeing the big picture, putting the pieces together, understanding other people's perspective, creating something the world didn't know was missing. And so a follow-on question to that is, if that's the case, that's what people are going to be doing, how do you motivate people to do this? And that ended up leading me to this body of research, about 50 years of research in the science of motivation, which says it's complicated, it's nuanced, but at its heart, or one of the biggest takeaways at least, is the following. There's a certain kind of reward that we use in organizations and in schools. And I want to get to schools and Montessori in a moment, that we use in schools and in organizations. Social psychologists call it a controlling contingent reward. I call it an if-then reward. And what we know about if-then rewards from 50 years of science is this. If-then rewards are extremely effective for simple tasks with short time horizons. They work very well. Human beings do respond in a somewhat predictable way to rewards. And one of the things that rewards do is they narrow our focus, which is actually an advantage if you're doing something for which there's an algorithm for doing it, whether, again, it's with your brain or with your body. So if-then rewards are great for simple and short-term tasks, but the same body of research shows us that if-then rewards are less great for more complex creative tasks. Because, again, what they do is they narrow our focus, they stunt our time horizon, and that's good for some tasks, but for other kinds of things, it's less good. And so what we have is a set of motivators that are good in many ways for 19th century work, to some extent a lot of 20th century work, but that are becoming outdated when we try to apply them to 21st century work. And instead, the better approach is to pay people well and then offer them three essential ingredients. One is autonomy, or really self-direction, giving them control over what they do, how they do it, at least some control over what they do, how they do it, when they do it, who they do it with. Mastery, which is our desire to get better at things that matter and to make progress in meaningful work. And purpose. And purpose is about essentially knowing why you're doing something. Does your work make a difference? Does your work make a contribution? And it turns out that those three ingredients, again, once you pay people well, those three ingredients are what really lead to enduring motivation.
Did you want to touch on something with education Montessori?
What I think is interesting is that in many ways our schools are, have been modeled after the way that we run businesses. And so this is not a great insight. Gazillions of people have said this. But what our schools are in many ways built like factories. Our schools are about they traditionally have used a lot of if-then rewards. They have traditionally favored compliance in the way that a factory would favor compliance. Again, that's not an original insight on my part. As I said, gazillions of people have said it. That said, when we think about education and we actually look at the research on how kids actually learn, there are some very close similarities to this notion of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Mm-hmm. That is, when kids have a degree of self-direction, they can learn better. When kids are getting feedback on how they're doing, so they know whether they're making progress, they learn better. And when they know why they're doing something, they learn better. And if you go back to Maria Montessori, literally like over 100 years ago, mm-hmm. she was actually putting these ingredients in place in education systems, based on a philosophy that she had that turns out to be extraordinarily consistent with what the science has told us about what really motivates people. So I happen to be a big fan of the Montessori approach because I think it's so consistent with the science of what really fosters high performance learning and engagement.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the layer on top of that is that Dr. Montessori was not satisfied with the way it was in her Italian homeland, so she wanted more purpose, something was motivating her to work with these children who nobody would work with and to foster their education. So
yeah. So she was way ahead of her.
Yeah,
she was way ahead of her time.
Yeah.
It's one reason why, if you look at certain kinds of education approaches in the United States over the last 50 or 60 years, we've gone through certain fads, and so certain things are popular for one brief shining moment, and then they burn out and they no longer are around. Meanwhile, you literally have Montessori schools all over the United States, not to mention the rest of the world, again, based on a philosophy that was fashioned literally more than 100 years ago.
I think you mentioned in Drive homeschooling, and when I was reading that portion, the Montessori also hooked into that.
I've written about homeschooling before. I think it's interesting because it's so self-directed, and there's something to be said for that degree of self-direction. The criticism people have of certain kinds of, and there are different movements within homeschooling. There's a movement called unschooling, which is really much more student-centered, much more self-directed, and you see it actually moving somewhat slowly to the mainstream. Typically, 30 years ago, homeschooling, where it was even legal, it wasn't legal in every jurisdiction. It was really the province of people with strongly held religious views, usually mostly Christian, often politically conservative, and then on the other side, extraordinarily secular, left-wing hippie types. And now it has migrated slowly to being a little bit more of a mainstream choice. In many ways, I think it's consistent with the move toward more and more people working for themselves. Now you have more and more people learning for themselves. And so, and if you go more broadly beyond the school age population, how are adults learning things? They're doing it in a very self-directed way. One of the greatest engines of learning in the world is YouTube. So people are learning how to play guitar chords or paint a house or knit a sweater based on, in this very self-directed way, using YouTube videos rather than going to a formal course where you're sitting in neat rows and someone in the front of the room is talking to you and you are dutifully taking notes and complying with what that person tells you to do.
It's more just in time and the proliferation of information. Now, I wanted to get to your latest work, When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. But before now there's no pressure, but I wanted to let you know that this is my 49th episode.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay.
Right before 50. Okay.
So,
anyway.
you're ending your 40s, moving into the 50s.
Anything you want to say about When, or how you got from Drive to When?
Well, the idea behind When is based on, again, it's obviously a research-based book, and it suggests that when we make our timing decisions, from when to do things during the day to when to start a project, when to stop a project, etc. When we make these decisions about when to do things, we tend to make them in a pretty haphazard way, making them based on intuition and guesswork, when in fact that's the wrong way to do it, because over the last several years, across multiple disciplines, literally 24 disciplines, what's been emerging is a fairly coherent science of timing that we can use to make systematically better, smarter, shrewder decisions about when to do things. And so this book is about the science of timing and how we can deploy it to do better in making those kinds of decisions, whether it's when in the day to do certain kinds of work, when to take a break, how beginnings affect us, how midpoints affect us, how endings affect us, how groups synchronize in time.
I found that interesting that it was across not only ages but ethnic groups, and it was fairly global.
Yeah, I mean, on certain things, certainly the diurnal patterns and the effect of the day on our cognitive abilities and our performance, that it's heavily biological. And then even some of the other sorts of things, the other sorts of phenomena that you see, for instance, this idea about midpoints where at midlife there isn't a crisis at all. That's complete nonsense.
There is
not a midlife crisis. That's complete nonsense. What there is instead is this gentle U-shaped curve of well-being, where people's overall well-being in, say, their 50s does dip a little bit, but doesn't plummet. It's shaped like a gently sloped U. And one of the things that's interesting about that research is that U-shaped curve of well-being, where you have a midlife dip, that has been found in something like 70 countries. So it doesn't seem to have, it's not an American phenomenon. It ends up being something of a phenomenon of human beings living in our moment.
Thank you so much for going through that path. It's very interesting. And I would encourage folks to go and check out When. All your information is on danpink.com, your website, right?
Yes.
Well, that's about all the time we have for now. So I wanted to thank you for your insights and conversation, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Jen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening. Today, my guest once again has been Daniel Pink, and I'm Janet Lee. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Well, Don't Tell the Kids.